Again, would like to extend a warm welcome to everyone for joining us today on this chilly spring day. I also would like to thank my colleague and friend, Lisa Johnson, for going on this adventure with me today, uh, and outlining some design principles for native pollinators. So we've got about an hour here to work with. So obviously this won't be a masterclass on landscape design, but it will hopefully get you some ideas of where to start with your landscape planning and landscape design with natives, especially when you have a focus for pollinators. So I'm going to run through some overview of the landscape design fundamentals, landscape design and how that relates to pollinator needs. Then I'm going to refer to my expert plant lady Lisa to get into native plant selection and native plants for pollinators throughout the season. So that's where we'll do our handoff here. So let's get started. So when we talk about design, and in this particular instance, landscape design, there are really 5 general principles that we like to consider. And I say principles of design because really in this instance, we're talking about landscapes and native plants for pollinators, obviously. But these fundamentals of design really pertain to whether you're doing landscape design or maybe you're making a really elaborate quilt. Some of these same principles apply. So it's just a really nice sort of overarching starting point for things to keep in mind while you're beginning your design process. So we always start with, unity and harmony, creating space that makes sense. Then we move into sort of balance and proportion that deals with scale and the relationship to the landscape. Rhythm and repetition that creates movement and connectivity throughout the landscape. And then emphasis and focalization. So that's creating the gem or the jewel of the landscape and creating focal points, things that really draw you into the landscape. And finally, in this aspect of fundamental principles, we talk about simplicity. The simplicity is kind of a repetition. Some other design individuals might know this as an acronym called KISS, or Keep It Simple, Stupid. It's just really good following those principles and learning how to rein in your editing as far as simplicity goes. So we're going to touch on each one of these, and then we'll get drill down into design for native perennials. So when we begin and we talk about unity and harmony, I always like to refer to this as there's a place for everything and everything in its place. So when we're looking at a larger landscape plan, really the things we're interested in here are how all of the elements that we're trying to create in a space, how do they relate to each other? When I work with clients, and I should back up maybe for a second, I'm a horticultural outreach specialist with Extension, but I also have 28 years as a landscape designer in the green industry. So this is really my passion, is design. And this is something I speak with my clients quite a bit about, is creating a cohesive space that makes sense and creating unity and harmony within those various elements so that everything works together. And that's everything from your hardscape spaces, your green spaces, and your plant materials, and how that relates to the larger landscape. So, we want to think about all those things when we're beginning our design process. Another fundamental principle is balance and proportion. This is really critical. Another way to look at this is considering scale. We always want to have elements within a larger landscape that relate to, oftentimes I say, human scale. But it depends upon your site and your environment. Obviously, you don't want to put bigger things in front of smaller things. You want to find a balance. You want to find equilibrium within the space, and you do that again through plant selection in large part in the landscape, and we'll get to that later on. But this just ensures balance, stability, which lends itself to a pleasing aesthetic overall. So then another principle that we focus on is rhythm and repetition. Rhythm, movement. I often like to say that not every space within a landscape, be it your front yard, backyard, whatever spaces, should be a brand new space. And the way we do that is by repeating plant material, repeating textures, repeating colors throughout the landscape. And an easy way to do that is to consider similar groupings as you move about the landscape. And if you do that, you really will have this sense of movement. You'll have a sense of rhythm, picking out particular plants that play off of those aesthetics too, really help put that together. So groupings, massings, all of those things can help lead your eye into the next space, which creates a sense of movement and cohesiveness again. Another element, the fourth element in my list here, is emphasis and focalization. Now, focalization is just a fancy word for creating a focus or a focal point within the landscape. This is often where I talk about bringing in a human element, bring in something that really draws you into a place, be it some kind of garden art, sculpture. In this particular instance, this example I've got on the screen here is, the statue in this sort of more ornamental garden, and those trees really shape and create your focal viewpoint. Another way to consider this is actually, again, through plant selection. If you think about what colors with plants do to your eyes, you can create focal points by doing that too. So cooler colors, blues, whites, those types of things tend to cause your eye to pause within a landscape and create a slowing down of movement. And obviously more vibrant colors, reds, oranges, yellows, as in this photograph, really draw your eye, grab your attention, and direct you through the landscape a little bit more. So that's a good thing to think about too when you're creating focal points, or even movement and rhythm. It kind of relates to that one too. Color really plays a huge role in how we push-pull our experience through a landscape. So that's really an important thing to think about. I often see clients go to the garden center with great intentions, pick out all kinds of lovely plants, and don't have a clear plan or conception of where they're going to go. And they end up with what I call the dandelion effect, where they come home and they kind of scatter around the yard wherever they've got a spot to fit the next great plant. Well, if we back up and we start to think about design and come up with a plan, then we're really creating this outline to then fill in those spaces with the correct plant material. And that's really what we're going to get into in the next phase. The final overarching design principle here that I like to talk about is this simplicity. This, as I referred to, the KISS acronym, where we just keep it simple, editing. Now, that doesn't mean a reduction of overall plant material necessarily. It doesn't mean in your entire landscape we only have 3 plants or 3 impact plants. It's not really what we're talking about here. What we're talking about is just not creating spaces of clutter. Again, it goes back to cohesiveness. You can have large massings of perennial spaces or even annual spaces within the landscape, but if you keep them simple and organized, it reads to your eye, and it just, again, ties back into cohesion and makes sense. It creates balance. It gets back to the idea that more is not better. Sometimes less is more. And that means maybe we're picking 5 particular plant groupings or plant materials that we want to work with, really emphasize and repeat, versus 25 and having this just random mishmash of unorganized but maybe beautiful plant material that just doesn't allow your eye to relate the space in a way that feels cohesive. So simplicity, editing, refining your elements really makes a big difference in an overall landscape. So those are kind of the overarching design principles. There's more, and like I said, we don't have time to get into all of what landscape architecture really ties into, but for today, that's kind of a good starting point on things to consider. And I'm going to do my best to relate those into our next point, which is really the meat of our talk today, which is creating designs within the landscape that really work with native plant materials and really try to reinforce our need for creating habitat and space for pollinators within our greater landscape. So within this principle, we're talking about other aspects. And like I said, they do relate to our overarching principles, and we'll talk about that a little bit, but we get a little bit more specific. We drill down a little bit more into connectivity, plant diversity, plant layering, creating habitat, shelter, nesting sites, creating water sources, availability for our pollinators and our other wildlife. Seasonal interest is a big part. And then again, the meat of our topic here, and our plant expert will get into the actual selection. So I like to think about this as actually almost a blank coloring book page. So when we're doing a plan and we're putting together an overall concept for a landscape, I always like to approach it from a size, form, function standpoint. So if you think about what you're trying to work with in a space, and instead of calling out a particular plant material in the beginning, you start working from a size, form, function standpoint and create this framework. So a blank coloring book page. Once you create that framework, then when you get to the native plant selection, that's the fun part. That's where you start coloring in the lines. You start adding that interest, adding that color to fill the roles that you've laid out in your overall plan for your space. So let's get into this a little bit. When we talk about connectivity, this, I believe, really ties back into the unity and harmony overarching design principle. Connectivity really talks about, in our focus on pollinators, movement and creating corridors and connectivity between not only your garden space, but if we think about it on a larger whole, your community, your neighbor's garden, your community gardens, your regional gardens, and how your little effort or your space that you have stewardship over, that you get to manage, how does that relate to the larger environment? And what can you do within your space to not only bring pollinators in and support them, but give them that connection through the larger landscape? So this is really an important thing to think about when we begin outlining our overall design and our overall plan for our space. So then we get into what does that mean? What does it mean to start designing and layering our space? So you really want to take a comprehensive, cohesive sort of viewpoint of design, and you don't want to work with monocultures. I like to think of monocultures as if you looked around your neighborhood and every single house in your neighborhood was the same 1950s ranch house. Nothing wrong with the 1950s ranch house, but if every single house in your neighborhood was exactly the same, you're not creating much diversity, you're not creating much visual interest. So when we relate it back to landscape design, you really want to create layers. You want to think about the over canopy, the mid-height canopy, your sort of waist-high canopy, and then what's at your feet, what's at your ankles, what's at your feet. So you want to think about it really truly from the ground up. And we begin by doing that with ground covers, then our mid-height, maybe perennial plants. Then we work into shrubs, evergreen shrubs, deciduous shrubs, maybe larger evergreen trees, and then our overarching deciduous trees typically. And each one of those specific plant material types has a role to play with pollinators. They create different habitats, they create different microclimates within the landscape. So focusing on those is really pretty critical in the overall scheme of things. And it ties back into scale. It ties back into creating rhythm and balance and proportion. So we're tying back into those overarching design principles. Now, kind of automatically, if you're thinking about layering within your landscape, you're automatically creating habitat diversity. Go back to my house, 1950s ranch house example. Monoculture, if you plant all of the same lilac hedge or all of the same, let's just use turf grass. Let's say you've got a yard just full of turf grass. You've created a singular environment, which does very little to promote a wide variety of habitats and availability for species, be it pollinators or other wildlife species, to move through the landscape, and not only move through the landscape, but inhabit your landscape. So when we start talk about habitat diversity, we talk about layering. By bringing in these different plant materials, you're going to automatically create different habitat diversity. You can take that one step forward and think about your landscape. Now, maybe you've, depending upon if you've got a small urban yard or maybe a larger rural space where you've got the ability to work off woodlands and wetlands and other water features. But even in an urban environment, again, it ties back to unity and harmony a little bit. Again, you need to think about what's going on in your larger environment. Are you 2 blocks from a city park that has a pollinator garden? Well, that's part of your overall corridor. So the more diversity we can create within our landscapes, the more variety of plant material, really focusing on those native plant materials, the more habitat we're going to create in the larger landscape for our pollinators. In doing that, these all really kind of tie together. We create habitat diversity. We're also creating shelter, nesting sites, and those types of things also for our pollinators. This ties back to what I mentioned earlier. There's a place for everything and everything in its place. So when we're thinking about a larger landscape design, I often have clients say, well, we don't know if we've got space for a compost bin, or where do we store our brush piles if we're depending upon what your environment is. We can plan for those things. And I think we need to plan for those things, and really think about the overall landscape as a whole and not just one singular garden. So it's very easy within a larger landscape. Now, maybe you're not leaving brush piles around, or maybe you don't have dead wood around, but even not doing that late season fall cleanup is allowing and leaving materials in the landscape for pollinators in particular to use and to work with for overwintering and those types of things. I often get questions about water sources. Water sources are actually very critical to pollinators. It's kind of a no-brainer. Most living creatures need water of some sort, especially considering the droughty conditions we've had in our area the last few years. And it can be as simple as a bird bath. Go one step simpler. I happen to raise bees, and in my bee area, I don't have a bird bath. What I've got is a big, large dish of water that I fill with rocks, or I've seen people use marbles. You want to have a place for these pollinators to land and not be immersed in water where they can get a drink. Now, if you're fortunate enough to be around ponds or streams, well, you've got that natural environment working for you, but it is important to figure out a way to incorporate that. I get some pushback sometimes from clients. Well, if I bring in a bird bath, or we've got a pond or something like that in our environment, aren't we just inviting mosquitoes? Well, not really. Bird baths, I would hope that you're conscientiously changing that water at least once a week. Ponds, when I work with clients and we install ponds or water features within a greater landscape, usually those are moving water features. So if you've got moving water, or you're being conscientious about changing that water out, it takes mosquitoes about 10 days to go from egg to biting you on your patio. So you've got a little bit of time to work with that. So I think it's essential, and often gets overlooked when we put together landscape plans, to consider these elements as well. Seasonal interest is a big thing. Besides low maintenance, which I always relate back to using native plant materials, the next thing I get is we want interest throughout all 4 seasons, not just spring and summer or spring and fall, but winter. Winter is one that shouldn't be overlooked. So I think if we go back to our overarching design principles again, this is where you can work on focalization. You can still work on rhythm and repetition, and you can also create focal points. So, spring flowering things also create focal points, and it's really easy to do. It's one thing that we really focus on, especially with native plantings, that you want to have something in bloom for pollinators really from as early in April with some of our native squill and other small plants that pop up all the way through fall, just to give them the best chance of overwintering. So whether it's your red flowering maple trees, which bring interest, or your spring flowering apple trees, there's always a way to bring in some kind of seasonal interest and create that year-round perpetual bloom and nectar availability for our pollinators. And again, don't overlook the winter. This lower picture might be difficult to see on your screens, but the lower right picture I have is there's a lot of beauty to be had in a winter landscape that hasn't been mowed flat. Grasses will persist through the winter time until we get a heavy wet snow. Certain types of perennials, echinacea, sages, even some of our solidagos really like to punch up and have great structure in the wintertime. You get that with a little bit of hoarfrost on it in late fall, early winter, and the sun comes out in the morning. It's spectacular. It might be more spectacular than, you know, a spring garden in some cases. So just don't overlook that critical winter season. So with all of those things being said, those are really the bones of the landscape design process. And that's where I go back to the blank coloring book. If you work with a lot of these principles to do your overall layout and keep conscientiously thinking about size, form, and function within each one of those levels, especially when you're talking about layering of plants, I often say I approach planting not from I have to put a lilac in your yard, where can I put a lilac, but rather in this particular space, I want a spring flowering shrub that's 4 feet tall by 4 feet wide that flowers in the springtime and has some fall interest. So now we've opened up our plant palette, and that could be 3, 4, 5 different things. You can do that at every level of your landscape planning. And then you get to the fun part. And you get to the fun part of actually choosing which plants fill those roles and really beginning to color in and add life and vibrancy to your overall landscape. And so plant selection, especially native plant selection, is really critical to our pollinators. It does so many things, from everything from, you know, working with our climate change issues to improving soil conditions. Native plant materials, root structures just go deeper than anything else we've got. They often tend to work and clean heavy metals out of our soils. So they're constantly working for us. Native plants also, kind of a no-brainer again, have evolved with our pollinators. So the native plants that we've got in our area are supporting the pollinators that need to feed on them from spring through fall. And so they're going to continue to do that. So really take your time with this next part. Lisa's really gonna give you some great talking points and some great ideas for all different types of garden spaces and different types of microclimates that'll help you color in your outlined landscape layout. So at this point, I will pass it on to Lisa, and she will share her plant knowledge with you.
Thanks, Tim. Next slide, please. There we go. All right, so I'm going to reiterate a couple of points that Tim mentioned before getting into the actual plant laundry list. And it's a short laundry list. Because of time, I mean, there are hundreds of plants you could choose from. Actually, I am putting into the chat right now a link to a new publication that I've put together. It's more of a visual chart that gives you a list of good native pollinator plants and their heights, whether they grow in sun or shade, and what season they bloom in. So it's kind of a map of seasonal interest. So when we're talking about plant selection, we do want to include trees and shrubs. I don't have any trees and shrubs in the presentation today because, again, short on time. But if you have a question about them, you can certainly get in touch with me. And I have, 6 or 7 that I really do recommend. So pollinator-friendly trees and shrubs, some of those will support up to 500 species of not only lepidopterans, which are the butterflies and moths, but also beetles and other pollinating insects. Now, if you are landscaping, particularly to support butterflies or moths, you've got to remember that you need both larval and adult host plants. And some pollinators are going to be specialist feeders like the monarch that needs milkweeds for its caterpillars, and others are generalists that will be able to feed on a number of different plants. So as Tim was saying, you need to support pollinators early in the season through late in the season. And pollen and nectar is primarily what they are after. Couple of other things to add to that landscape that, again, Tim has addressed, so I'm not going to be talking about, but butterflies are going to need some kind of water source and ideally some rocks to bask on, or sometimes your deck or your porch can also provide that. Okay, so next slide, please. Okay, so we've talked about making sure that you have selected things that are appropriate for your climate. This is the brand spanking new USDA plant hardiness zone map that has just come out. And there were over 13,000 different weather stations that were participating in this. So it's gotten a lot more accurate over time, and you can use that as a guide for choosing your plant material. Next slide. Light levels, that's another thing to consider, and I'll be giving you some examples of plants that take sun or take shade. And sometimes it's difficult to figure out what sun and shade mean. So I've kind of put a little bit of a definition here. You know, when they say a plant takes shade, that may not mean deep shade where it does not get any sun at all. But it would, in fact, maybe need dappled light or light under a tall canopy, or perhaps a half a day of sun. And conversely, sun, when they say full sun, that doesn't necessarily mean from morning until night. It does mean ideally 6 to 8 hours of uninterrupted sun. But if you have, you know, a few hours of sun in the morning and then a few hours of sun in the afternoon, that adds up to 6 or 8, that will work just as well. If you're trying to push the envelope for a plant that needs more light than you have, keep in mind that afternoon sun is going to be more intense than morning sun. And also sun and heat are not the same thing. Some plants that like sun aren't necessarily ones that like heat and may not be particularly happy about being on the south side of your white house right up against it. Next slide. Okay, so also making sure that your chosen plant material is going to match what you actually have. I do recommend getting a soil test if you've never had one done. It's fairly inexpensive, and it will save you a lot of heartache in the future when you're choosing plants. So there's the information there. And this is the brand spanking new chart that I was talking about. I realize you can't read it here, but I put the link in the chat. And again, it is color-coded for plants for more sun or more shade, when they bloom, what their height is, and the color of the bloom. So you can use that as a resource. Okay, actually getting into the plant material, we'll talk about early season plants for partial shade. And again, this is a very small selection. Next slide. So this is one of my favorites, one of the very earliest bloomers. This is bloodroot, and it is not only hardy to Wisconsin, but the Midwest, very hardy across the state, actually. And it is one that the early season pollinators really, really like. It's also a self-cleaner, so when it drops its petals, you can see what it looks like. That leaf originally starts kind of rolled up against the stem, and the flower stalk comes through it. Then the flower finishes and the leaf unrolls, and it's got the most amazing shape. And the leaf will get bigger over time as well. This plant does tend to form colonies. It's easy to divide, however, and it is tolerant of black walnut, which is really a nice thing. Its name actually comes from if you cut a stem, if you cut a leaf, if you cut the root, all parts will kind of bleed this bright reddish orange sap. So that's where the name bloodroot comes from. It's rather startling if you haven't seen it before, and it does stain, so keep that in mind. Next slide. My background here is actually this plant, Jacob's Ladder. This one blooms a little bit later in the spring, and it is also fairly petite. Most of our woodland early season flowering plants are going to be fairly petite. This one, like bloodroot, does hang around all season. It's not an ephemeral. And it has really interesting leaves that kind of look like a ladder. That's how it has its name from. And light shade is preferred for this one. The flowers are bell-shaped, up-facing, and fairly small, about a little less than half an inch, I guess I'd say. It prefers not really dry shade, but medium average soil to moister soil. And you can go to the next slide. Okay, that is Marybelle's, also called bellwort. That's a taller one, and that one starts to bloom in late April and goes through May. And it is a little, like I said, a little bit taller plant. Really interesting flower that's pendant, so it hangs, but the petals are kind of twisted, which is sort of interesting. Now, this one spreads very slowly by rhizomes. It's not going to make a colony like the bloodroot, but it does, the clump will get a little bigger over time. One thing to keep in mind, though, is if you have heavy deer pressure, probably not a good plant for you, since deer do find this palatable. Next slide. Virginia bluebells. This, to me, is one of the most iconic plants that says spring to me in Wisconsin. You pair this with trilliums, and it's just one of the most heavenly combinations there are. So this one is also very hardy. It does go dormant in mid to late June, so be prepared for a hole in your garden. You might want to plant other things within it that go that start to come out a bit later. And this one does tolerate rabbits, so that's always a good thing. Wild geranium, this one is a little later yet in the spring, and this one does form colonies. It has interesting seed dispersal method that helps it form those colonies, where the kind of beaky shaped seed capsule will split and the seeds get flung into the air, and wherever they land, they can germinate. This one is helpful because it also takes drier shade. And a pretty flower that's a little bit bigger than most, and it has an interesting leaf as well. Next slide. Okay, so now we're going to move into early season plants for sun. So these are mostly prairie plants. Eastern pasque-flower, this one's very petite as well, but blooms about the same time as bloodroot, except in the sun. So early season pollinators really like this plant. And this plant is also adapted to alkaline soil. So if you're in the lower half of the state, that's a happy thing for you. And it has light blue to purple to white flowers and very fuzzy leaves that are create interest in the landscape. You can go to the next slide. This one will take partial shade, actually. May be somewhat long or short-lived, so do make sure that the seeds get spread about. This one will take average soil and grows, and you can see a variety of different environments. So it's pretty tolerant of a lot of different things. And this one is interesting as well because it's in the carrot family, and the black swallowtail butterflies in particular, the caterpillars like to eat the foliage. Next, Horticulture. This is an interesting plant in prairie situations. The word puccoon refers to a dye, but it also refers to the seed, which is supposedly rock hard. The hoary part of the name is another word for hairy, and the leaves, if you look at them close up, are in fact hairy. This one is a showstopper with that bright golden yellow bloom. It will take moderate to dry soils. Again, it prefers full sun, but will take a light amount of shade as well. And it has a long bloom period, April through June. Next. Prairie phlox. This one is a little later starting in the season, but it goes quite a bit later too, all the way to early July. This one sometimes gets confused for an invasive plant called Dame's Rocket. Dame's Rocket looks similar and has a similar color range because they both will vary from white to pink to maybe a darker purple or this orchid color. But Dame's Rocket, the invasive, is in the mustard family, and the flowers have 4 petals, not 5. And the leaves are much fuzzier and bigger on the Dame's Rocket. This one prefers to get, again, mostly sun if at all possible, but it will take like half a day of shade if you give it afternoon sun. And you can see it grows in a variety of places as well. And it's very tolerant of different soil types, all the way from medium wet. So if you've got clay, this is fine, to drier soils as well. Okay, moving on to mid-season plants for partial shade. I just have a couple of these, and they're both lobelias. There are a few others, of course, but these are the ones that I mainly think of in terms of pollinators, and also they help form that middle layer in the garden that Tim was talking about because they're taller plants. So this is cardinal flower, and if you like hummingbirds, this is a great plant for hummingbirds. They really like it. We have quite a few plants of it in the Dane County Extension teaching garden, and people are always coming to get me and say, hey, the hummingbirds are at the cardinal flower again. And I'll put in a plug for our teaching garden quickly here at the Dane County Extension office. It's a public garden that is open any time of year. If you go to the Dane County Extension website, in the Horticulture tab, there's information about it. And each plant has a QR code so that you can learn more about it, and you can take a virtual tour from the website as well. So cardinal flower has a long bloom, and it blooms later in the season, July to September. It does not tolerate dry soil. So this is one that needs, if not heavy soils, at least moist soils. It's not real long-lived. So I make sure that I spread the seed around, or that I use transplants every once in a while. Next. And this is the other lobelia species, great blue lobelia. This one is a little taller, but more or less in the same range, and likes the same kind of conditions, average to wet soils, has the same bloom period as well. So very nice plants for that kind of environment. Next. Okay, so now we'll move into mid-season plants for sun. And this is where I would say a lot of the pollinator plants fall into this category. And so that is taller plants that are going to bloom usually from June through September, or at least somewhere in that range. So if you're trying to attract monarchs, of course, you need to provide some milkweeds. We do have a number of milkweed species that grow in the state. The one that I don't recommend, even though it's one of the ones that the butterflies like the most, is the common milkweed, because it is a garden thug and it is bent on world domination to the exclusion of many other plants. So that's why I'm not very thrilled about that one and recommend other species of milkweed. So this is one of them. We do have some specimens of this in the teaching garden. It is a real showstopper for color, and it has a decently long bloom period. There are some nativars, which are cultivated forms of the wild type. So there's one called Hello Yellow that has been bred for, or selected, I should say, from wild populations, and then bred for yellow color. Our native coneflower, this is the one that is native to Wisconsin. Purple coneflower is actually not a Wisconsin native, but it is native to the Midwest. This one is a good height and is one that a lot of the bee species like a lot, and decently long bloom period as well, also tolerant of deer and clay soils. So this was a nice one too. We have about 12 species of liatris that are native to Wisconsin. I just have one in this presentation, but there are a number of them, and butterflies actually just go nuts over them. They're mostly going to be in the 2 to 4 foot range. And yeah, later in the season blooming. Another milkweed for the butterflies, but not only the butterflies. You can see a number of species really like this plant, either for the pollen or the nectar, or in the case of the milkweed bug, they like actually feeding on the juice of the seed pods. So lots of plants use milkweed. Actually, there's a book I learned about yesterday. I haven't read it yet, but it's called Milkweed Lands, and it's all about milkweeds. So if you're interested in those, you might want to check that book out. This one has a later in the season bloom. It is not real long lived, so you need to make sure that you spread the seed around for this one. A tall plant, so definitely in that upper range of the middle layer. Next. Okay, where are we here? Sorry, I just lost my place. Okay, spotted Joe pieweed. This is one where I actually do recommend for most gardens to go with a nativar. The nativars are much more compact. A lot of gardens can't handle a 7-foot tall plant, and they sometimes need to be either tied or staked or something, or at least planted densely around to hold them up. But the nativars, such as Phantom or Little Joe, look exactly the same. They're just shorter, and they still attract a lot of butterflies and other pollinators. Again, late season bloom for this. If you want to see one, go to the Dane County Extension website under our wet garden, and you can see what one of those nativars looks like, and it'll look a whole lot like this picture. Next. All right, late season plants for partial shade. Got those. There are not a whole lot of them, but one of them is the common blue wood aster. This one does go quite late in the season, very graceful looking plant, and it's really nice for those late season pollinators. It is also one that is kind of that middle height. And you can go to the next slide. Turtlehead. Oh, I love turtlehead. If you look at the shape of the flower, it does kind of look like a turtle head if turtles were pink. And this one flowers very late in the season, when it's kind of nice to have something that isn't in the aster family that's flowering that time of year. It is fairly tall, and it does create colonies. So you do need to kind of keep it a bit in check but a really nice plant. Now, this one is only hardy to zone 5, so it is not hardy higher up in the state. Next. Late season plants for sun. Next. So these would mostly be asters and goldenrods. And I should mention the turtlehead also can take full sun as long as it has enough moisture. So aromatic aster is one of the many, many, many asters that we have that are native to the state. You can see it's quite hardy throughout the state. A lot of the asters get quite tall. This one can get taller. And if you find that in your site it does get taller and tends to flop, it is possible to kind of give it a haircut to cut it back by about 1/3 in no later than June. And that may delay its flowering just a little bit, but not much. And it will cause it to branch out and be sturdier and shorter. Like most asters, they spread from seed. That is one thing about asters, is that you kind of have to keep a lid on that. Ironweed. Oh, that is the color. That really is the color. It is spectacular. Very, very tall plant, especially in moist soils, but the butterflies really love it. And it does bloom late in the season, and it will tolerate some light shade as well. If you like this plant a lot and you like the color but not the height, there is a nativar that I just learned about last year that is much, much shorter, like 18 to 24 inches, same color flower. It's called Summer Swan Song. And we do have a few species of ironweed that are native to Wisconsin, but they're mostly about the same height and they can interbreed with each other. Next. Many species of goldenrod. The one, of course, I don't recommend is the one that sometimes seeds itself in without your permission, the Canada goldenrod. That one's kind of a garden thug too. But this one is a clump former. And oh, I see the bloom time got left off. That's July to October. And this one will take partial shade, but it also will take full sun. A couple of resources for you. I'll go through this fairly quickly because we're running out of time. So there are some nice books here that I'll let you read about later. I do really recommend Bringing Nature Home by Doug Tallamy. He is one of the biggest proponents of native plants, and by the time you finish reading it, you will agree with him. So next. This is one other one. Lynn Steiner was Wisconsin native. So there are a lot of Wisconsin plants in here that will do nicely in your landscape. Next. If you're looking for books on plant ID so that you can see the bigger palette of what's available in Wisconsin and the Midwest, any of these books would be fine for that purpose. Next. Online resources, I highly recommend our Pollinator site. That's at the Wisconsin Horticulture site. That's also where that chart is located. But we have other herbarium sites that are great for information. The Arboretum is great for information. And a couple of the other states like Minnesota have really nice information on wildflowers. Next. Okay. Thank you very much. And we will go to questions.
Thank you, Lisa and Tim, for sharing just a little piece of your knowledge about this topic. I know you have quite a bit of knowledge to share. I would like to point out that we do have an evaluation form and put that in the chat. So if everyone could just take a moment and fill that out after the webinar ends, we appreciate your feedback. It will also pop up at the end of the webinar. I am going to go through as many questions as I can in the time that we have left. Tim, I'm going to direct the first one to you, and I can share the this question because I feel the same way. They said that they totally understand your design points. I think those really made a lot of sense. But what if you're just not quite that artist? You know, we plant according to the sun and the shade and the soil requirements, but do we have to hire a professional if we're not quite as artistic?
Well, that's sort of a loaded question because this is what I do and it feeds my children. No, there's lots of resources out there. In fact, I would direct you right back to our UW Extension pollinator page. If you're looking to lay out a garden specifically designed for pollinators, we have several good sort of preset layouts that you could, manipulate to your space. So do you have to? No. Is it worth it? Probably. Being a design expert, I always kind of cringe a little bit that we get overlooked a little bit. People spend a lot of time thinking about how to build a house or lay out a house, and then the landscape kind of gets pushed off, and I think that's led us to where we are. So do you have to? No, there are plenty of resources. Xerxes Society has resources. We have resources. Again, University of Minnesota has resources. So if you do a little hunting and pecking, you'll find some good garden layouts to work with.
And I would just add to that, if you do want to do it yourself, start small. You don't have to
Yeah.
do your entire yard or your entire landscape at once. Start small, get that area under control, and go from there. Because if you take on too much, you won't be successful. So really, we want to set you up for success. So start with what you can manage and, go from there.
Excellent advice.
Thank you. I think I'm going to direct this next one to you, Lisa. The question was, why does spreading seed around help the plants that aren't long-lived?
Well, it provides the growing material for the next generation. So those plants will often come back from seed. If you can scratch the seed into the soil a little bit, that will help it even more to come back from seed, because the parent plant isn't necessarily, it may only live 3 years or so.
Okay, thank you. I'll mention too that there's a lot of resources shared. Lisa shared a lot of great books and websites. We are recording this. This recording link will be sent to you, and it will also be posted on our website within a week. So you will be able to refer back to the recording and be able to grab those resources as well. Another question that I'm sure a lot of us can share are about when we're battling an area that might have like burdock and thistle and ragweed, and we're trying to get those under control. When we're trying to reestablish or establish some native plants. Are there any natives that you might recommend that might be a little bit more aggressive, that if we have an area that they can spread and allow to kind of take over?
You know what I might actually do, if you've got thistle and burdock, and particularly thistle, you might want to use a cover crop called sorghum Sudan grass for a season or two. It's been shown by research to really outcompete these terrible weeds. It's super hard to get rid of thistle and burdock because of their root structures. So you might want to try that first before you actually invest in your natives, because I'd hate to see them struggle. And I tend to think, well, Canada goldenrod would certainly do the job, but I'm not going to recommend that thuggy plant. So that's what I would do, is try and get the weed issue under control first. If you don't mind using chemicals, of course, there's that, not very compatible with pollinators. But if you wanted to go the organic route, you might want to try that sorghum Sudan grass.
Thanks, Lisa. Tim, I'm going to direct this next one to you because you mentioned water, having a water feature in a pollinator garden. How close should that water feature be to the garden or for the pollinator area or for pollinators?
I would say that proximity isn't as important as finding the appropriate location in your landscape space so that you can maintain it. If you build it, they will find it. That's kind of the way I look at it. I have honeybees. I have several hives in my yard, and I find them in anything that remotely has water around my yard. So you don't have to put it right next door. You just have to make it available. And it's sort of like gardening in general for me. The further away you put it from your activity space, the more apt it is to be neglected. So put it somewhere where you can manage it, and they will find it.
Thanks, Tim. I will shoot this next question to either of you. I know that soil testing was mentioned, and we have some folks that are going to be in a more urban area that maybe the soil is high in toxins, whether or not they've had it tested, I'm not sure. But what are some steps to start to prepare an area that might have some toxins in it before starting a native garden?
You want that one, Lisa?
I was just going to ask you the same thing.
So let me say two things, and then I'll throw it back to you.
Okay.
And maybe Lisa can speak to this more directly. I know for a fact that there are certain plants, and they're not coming to the top of my head, that are actually, good at cleaning certain toxins from heavy metals in particular from soils. So going back to native plant materials versus, say, your typical turf grass, you're automatically going to be improving your environment that way. The next thing I always suggest to clients is compost, compost, compost. You can really fix a lot of soil problems by just amending it and amending it. I have an engineering friend that always says the solution to pollution is dilution. So if you can blend in that compost over time, again, it depends upon your toxins. So that soil test is critical, but I'd like to hear Lisa's thoughts too.
Well, you've pretty much spoken my thoughts already. I would for sure, if you know that you have toxins, and you're not sure which ones they are, I would get a heavy metal test done. And I agree that adding compost is a good idea. There are phytoremediation plants that are out there, and Tim, I can't remember any of them right now either, but I think if you do a Google search on that term phytoremediation, you will probably get a list of some of those.
Right. So get tested, know what you're dealing with the soil, and do some research about what plants might be able to be planted in that, and go from there. I would like to thank both Tim and Lisa again for all of your knowledge that you shared. If we didn't get to your question today, we do have a Ask a Gardening question form from the Extension Horticulture website that you can enter your question there, and it will be directed to someone to give you a customized and personalized answer. Good luck with all of your gardening this season, everybody. We hope to see you again.
Thank you.
Thanks.